from the heart of Dubai, where tomorrow is being built today, to the world. Welcome to the CTO Show with Mehmet. Here, we redefine technology and reimagine possibilities. With Mehmet, delve into the riveting realms of AI, cybersecurity, and digital technology. Experience the thrilling highs and lows of startups. Immerse yourself in the spirit of entrepreneurship and witness the future of business innovation being written in real time. Now, without further ado, let's tune in and explore the future.
Hello and welcome back to a new episode of the CTO Show with Mehmet. Today, I'm very pleased. Joining me from Canada, André Laplume. Andre, the way I like to do it is I keep it to my guests to introduce themselves, and feel free to tell us a bit more about your background, your journey, and what you're currently up to. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. Yes, I'm a professor. I'm André Laplume. I'm a professor at the Toronto Metropolitan University, and there I teach and do research in entrepreneurship and in strategy. And entrepreneurship has actually been an area of my primary interest recently, and I'm especially interested in the intersection between startups or entrepreneurs and in established incumbent organizations, right? Because they have all kinds of different types of interactions that go on. So a lot of my research has been on that interaction. I also, as part of my job as a professor, I train PhD students and master students, and they do research as well on these topics. And so the work that I'm talking about today is based to some extent on my research personally and the research of my co-authors and colleagues and students. So I'm happy to share with you guys today.
That's really cool. And, entrepreneurship, as the audience would know, it's something that I'm personally also passionate about. The place where I want to start is, the book that you released recently, which is called Spinout Ventures. And so if someone doesn't know, like, this is it's something related to entrepreneurship, we say, okay, spin out and ventures, like it's something like really kind of contradictory, because you see this kind of fusion things and so on. So you decided to call it Spin Out Ventures. Like, tell me a little bit more about what is the spin out here, in Musaf's team. And, how did you come up with the results? Of course, I know what means, but just for the audience.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we didn't coin the term spin out. Spin out's been used for some time to describe when employees leave a company to start their own company. And I think there's been some sort of confusion over time, because there's also another term, a corporate spinoff, which refers to when the management of an incumbent firm decides to take a business that they have and take it outside of the company as an independent company. But that's quite different from when individuals, and often very small teams, individuals or teams of 2 or 3 people who are employees at a company, and who decide together or individually to leave and to start a new venture. And so that's not a managerial decision. Usually that's a decision that's made by the individual employee entrepreneurs. And so that's what distinguishes them from things like corporate spinoffs. So we didn't coin the term, but we do use it, and we think it's a helpful term because there really isn't another term for it out there. Sometimes people say, well, startups founded by alumni of Microsoft or something like that, right? But the spin-out venture term, we think, is a good term to describe it. And it's been used quite a bit in the academic literature. So we're trying to bring it into the mainstream literature or the mainstream world.
Cool. Good to know. Now, based, of course, on, the research that you've done, you had a point, and, with your colleagues, and of course, the fellow students that help you with the research. So you busted a myth, which is, known as, like, usually startups start in garages, right? So everyone, when you tell startup, oh yeah, they started in the garage, like they remember Apple, they remember like a couple of other startups over there. But you say that the majority of startup companies actually, they started within, inside established organizations. So why do you think, this is the case? And, what are like some of the household names that began as spinouts? So just to
Yeah.
give example.
I mean, you mentioned Apple, so that's one of the examples that we use because in a way that people think of them as the garage entrepreneurship example, but it's actually not a very good example of that. Because if you look at the story a little more carefully, you see that Steve Wozniak was working at Hewlett Packard at the time, and he was working in all kinds of different roles, but he was also having access to the different components needed to build the first PC there. And so he had a prototype built largely from the things that he learned from his work. And he tried to pitch it several times to the management of HP before eventually leaving to found Apple with Steve Jobs. And so it's really an example of a spin-out venture, because there wasn't really much going on in that garage. Actually, a lot of the prototyping work and all the work related to building the first PCs were done while at Hewlett Packard, right? So I think it's a misnomer, or kind of like a misconception, that most of the work happens in a garage, because in reality, a lot of the different types of businesses, especially tech businesses that we want to launch today, as entrepreneurs, there's a lot to learn, right? And often it makes sense to learn it somewhere first, and then to take those ideas and to create new ventures from them.
Another example that came to my mind, Andre, is Intel. Because the 4 engineers that they started Intel, they were working to another semiconductor chip company, and they were not. I'm not saying in agreement with the management, but the management was like a little bit retrofit. The old style. They didn't want to try something new, and they get over there. So, from your research, have you seen like usually these founders, they come from, let's say, same background in a sense? I mean, they have like same characteristics, or is this, each time it can be, from different personality, it can be like from different type of employees within the company that they will go actually and start. So what I'm looking for, Andre, is actually if there's something within the personality of these founders or entrepreneurs. Like, is it always the same? Like, is it the same thing that motivates them to leave? Is it because they face rejections? What is it?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think a lot of the early research in entrepreneurship focused a lot on the personality of the entrepreneur, or what are the specific traits of the individuals. But I think when you look at the spin-out founders, what most of them have in common is that they've spent time learning in a learning environment, which is an established organization, and they've gotten to some point where they were triggered to form a spin-out. And we've seen lots of different examples. You gave an example of a strategic disagreement, right? It often happens when employees are perhaps unhappy with the decisions of management, and they want to pursue a spin out because they want to pursue a different strategy or a different technology that the parent organization is not interested in, right? So that's like the classic trigger. But there are many more, and research, recent research shows that the triggers can be pretty mundane. Like sometimes it's just interpersonal conflicts, that occur within the parent organization that leads to a spin out, right? Or sometimes there can be ethical conflicts where the employees perhaps they don't like the way that the company is being managed, or they don't like the way the business is being conducted, and they want to do it better, and so they leave to do a spin out that way. So often, the trigger, I would say, tends to be kind of a friction or a frustration that leads to this motivation to pursue their own venture.
Now, I'm not sure if the research also included like how much such startups are more successful than the ones that they start. That the entrepreneur didn't work any other place. So, is there like any statistics that shows their success ratio compared to the traditional way of how people think startups start?
Yeah, I mean, there have been studies. There haven't been a ton of studies, but the ones that have been done show that the spin-out ventures do tend to perform better. They tend to survive longer, and they tend to perform better in terms of growth. And one of the reasons for that is that often spin-outs will start with some degree of scale, right? Because instead of being a single entrepreneur or maybe a duo starting something from scratch, often it's a team of people who have been working on something for some time and who are taking it out of the company. And so often a spinout will start with a larger team. And Zoom, for example, is a spinout from Cisco's WebEx division. Eric Yuan, the founder of Zoom, was able to attract about 40 engineers from Cisco to join Zoom. So you can see that Zoom would be able to scale a lot faster that way by being able to bring those resources over rather than having to attract all those people completely independently, right? So there are these kinds of advantages that spinouts have that allow them to perform better. But other than scale, though, I mean, one of the key things is the inheritance of knowledge. I'm not necessarily talking about the proprietary knowledge of the parent organization. Sometimes it's just ideas that have been developed while working at a previous employer, and previous, companies can't often exploit all the ideas that they create. They often generate all kinds of ideas that ultimately they have to leave on the table, or they just decide that, this may be a great idea, but it's just a better idea for somebody else and not for us. And maybe it doesn't meet our internal margin threshold, right? So it can be rejected by an organization, but could be a great idea still for a startup. And so that's often how it happens. The founders of the startup when they're still employees, they find out about these new ideas and they see how they're validated and how there's already customers interested in them. And that's what helps them to put together their business plan to leave and to start their own venture.
Got it. Now, one thing that usually, we see it a lot and we hear it a lot and we read about it a lot is when such event happens. So the former employers start to get a little bit angry, frustrated. Sometimes, there are like some those suits over there and here, and oh, you stole this idea from us, and then all the things. So how do you think this is this you think it's first in the first place? Do they really have the right, if they have been presented the ideas and rejected, do you think they have the right to challenge their former employees? And in how do you think the founders or the entrepreneurs should handle such situations?
Yeah, it's interesting that what we see in the research is that the spinouts that I guess get the most hostile reaction from the parent firms tend to be the ones that compete directly with the parent, and those that take significant resources from the parent firm, including things like proprietary information. And that can often lead to a lawsuit, or it can lead to a negotiation, right? Which leads to some kind of licensing agreement or some kind of deal where that reduces competition. But those tend to be the ones that have the most hostility. You probably noticed that in a lot of jurisdictions now, the non-competes have been being banned. In Ontario here in Canada, they were banned recently, and in the United States, they were banned by the FTC at the federal level. Although it's being challenged in court, it's still a step forward. And so we're seeing many jurisdictions that recognize the importance of spin-out ventures, and they actually want to encourage them, right? And one way of doing that is by weakening some of these rules around things like non-competes. But there are other things like non-disclosure agreements and non-solicitation agreements or no poach agreements. And so I think spin-out founders always have to be careful to look at what they've actually signed, and to make sure that they're not putting themselves in a position to face litigation that they could lose, right? So it is, I think, something that they need to be cautious about, and I think that there's a lot of work that's been done to look at different ways that spin-out founders can try to reduce the hostility of their parent firms, right? And so that they can have actually more beneficial relationships with the parent firms. And what we see is a lot of vertical spin-outs that tend to use the parent firm as a supplier or as a customer. And so they're entering into business transactions, right? And exchanges. And that tends to really sort of improve the relationship between the spin-out and the parent organization. The other thing I want to say is I think we're seeing a trend overall, though, toward more parent firms or more incumbents are spin-out friendly, because they recognize that actually helps their reputation, because when they're friendly towards their spin-outs, that means that they're a good incubator of innovation. And then we've got a bunch of potential employees that want to go and work there, because everybody wants to go and work at a place where they can develop ideas into innovations, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you mentioned something, previously about, let's say the founder, or let's say the spin out founders, they go out and they, probably they will be joined by a couple of engineers or maybe some, colleagues over there. Do you think usually this is a good idea, or maybe, they should go and try to hire a completely new team? Is there like also any benchmark, like seeing what was the success of, getting some old friends and colleagues from the old company versus going and building a completely new team?
Well, I mean, I think that what we see is that there's an advantage in being able to build a team fairly quickly by attracting some of the former colleagues, right? Um, but if the startup founders are effective at attracting people from outside or from other organizations, then that can be, if they can do it effectively and quickly, recruiting people from outside, then that could be just as effective. It's just that on average, there's an advantage to being able to leverage your network from previous employment to be able to attract resources to your startup, right? And that doesn't, I'm not talking about necessarily solicitation or poaching here, because oftentimes it's, the employees of the parent organization find out about the spin out or hear about it or are attracted to go and work there, because they hear about the innovation, they hear about it succeeding outside. And so it isn't really necessarily something that leads to a lot of conflict, especially when we're talking about often a pretty small trickle of employees compared to a very large organizations. Like if you think about Cisco and the size of that company and the tens of thousands of employees that it has, right? When we start talking about 40 people leaving to go to work at Zoom, it's actually a tiny little number when you think about it. And so it isn't necessarily something that's going to threaten the survival of Cisco in any way.
Now, one thing that also like just came to my mind, is there like any other challenges, from these entrepreneurs? Um, because again, probably they didn't have any, I would say, startup experience, in a sense that they didn't start a company themselves. So what potentially, can go wrong when they do this? Like what kind of risks they might face? And is there like some ways that they could follow so they can navigate these challenges effectively?
Yeah, I mean I think that spinouts still, they still face many of the same hazards, that all startups face, and so there's perhaps a reduction in risk, in uncertainty for a spinout, but it doesn't shield them from that stuff at all, or doesn't shield them from that stuff entirely. But what we see is that the employees that have had experiences doing both the initiation of new ideas at the employee organization and also the execution. So, for example, someone who gets a chance to be a part of developing a new project or a new product or initiative for the parent company, and also who's had an experience in implementing it. So we call that sort of exploration and exploitation activities. And we find that the employees that have access to that kind of work, right? So where they're able to stretch themselves while they're still employees and better understand how new things are developed and also how they're implemented, those are the ones that tend to be the most successful. So actually the key knowledge often that they're bringing with them to the spin out isn't necessarily some specialized technical knowledge or very general business knowledge. What it is the knowledge around how to create how to create innovations and how to implement them.
So they brought with them tons of experience, and they have noticed, watched, how in their parent company, those founders, how they did these things, and they succeeded. So when it comes to the process itself, like if I want to take a very healthy and not negatively spin out creation process, I mean, in a sense, like okay, it was a mutual, the founders, I mean the entrepreneurs, they said, hey, we're gonna go. So what typically happens? Like do they have to prepare anything? Is there like some agreements that they have to sign, maybe with the old company, or like just they just go out, they submit their resignation, and maybe after 2 weeks or 3 weeks they say, hey, we're now incorporated our new company, and here we go? Like how usually this happens, the process?
Yeah, I think there's a spectrum, right? In the most extreme cases, you have what are the stealthy spinouts who they resign and then they go and they sort of disappear for a year and work on their spin out without releasing any information to the public. And often they're doing that because they're waiting out their restrictive covenants, right? They may be waiting out their non-solicitation, or they might be waiting out their non-compete. There are other reasons, right? And so in those cases, usually there isn't any kind of negotiation or discussion that happens. The spinout just basically forms and they go into business, and then if the parent firm notices in a short enough period of time, they might try to do something about it. But usually, these restrictive covenants have a pretty short lifespan. On the other hand, there are spinouts that want to negotiate with the parent organization because they know that they need access to technology from the parent organization and need a license. And so they might do a licensing agreement on their way out. Or sometimes they know that they want to have the parent organization as a supplier or as a customer. And so those processes are quite a bit different, and they look a lot more like a negotiation as opposed to a stealthy spinout that's leaving and just kind of trying to do its thing without being noticed.
Now, one thing, like, of course, some founders or entrepreneurs, they would need to go and raise funds. Do you see, Andre, that raising funds for spin out companies or ventures, do they have an advantage being employees in their old place, or is it like probably do they need to take different approaches when it comes to finding funds and getting some help? Can they go actually to their old firm and ask for capital?
I mean, that happens. I mean, if the old firm is providing the capital, for the venture, you might actually think about it as a more like a corporate spinoff or something like that. But sometimes they'll do a small percentage. Like AstraZeneca, for example, encourages some of its innovations to spin out, but they'll restrict their percentage to only 20% equity. And so the spinout still remains a very independent company and isn't in any way stifled in its direction by that 20% investment. But I think the vast majority of the spinouts don't seek investment from their parent organizations. Although often what they end up getting funding from previous contacts within the organization. So we see a lot of examples. Electronic Arts, for example, was able to attract some of its early investors from Apple, which is where Electronic Arts' founder was working, right? So there are lots of examples where the previous employers who know the skills and abilities of the spinout founders, they'll tend to become angel investors in the new venture. And in the most extreme examples, what we see in some firms like Microsoft and Palantir and companies that have a fairly large network actually of alumni and a lot of spinouts, is that they tend to tap into each other for funding. And so what you see is people who used to work for Cisco and were doing their own thing and were now funding other former Cisco employees in their ventures. And so there's this sort of alumni network that forms around the companies that are quite spinout friendly. In terms of VCs and others, they're quite interested actually in funding spinouts because they perceive that the spinouts have access to special knowledge, right, that they're taking with them from their parent organizations. And so if they're coming from especially if they're coming from successful tech companies or successful incumbent organizations, they tend to be quite attractive. I think the only case where it might be less so is if the parent organization is known to be particularly litigious or hostile towards spinouts, in which case it might scare off some of the more skittish VC, right? But another remedy for that potentially is to make sure that the spinout is differentiating itself well enough from the parent organization's businesses.
Yeah, one question also, I'm not sure if there are like any numbers or any statistics regarding this. What is the possibility that after the spin out happens, that parent company, they go back and they acquire the spin out venture?
Yeah, I mean, it does happen. And one of the reasons it happens readily is because often there's still a connection between the networks of the spinout founders and the parent organization. And there's also this idea that, spinouts often inherit a lot of different routines or ways of doing business, or even language in the way that they talk about different things, right? And so it really smooths the process of discussion for acquisition. And it also smooths the integration process if the parent organization decides to buy out the spinout later on. And so we do see that quite a bit. And I think the parent organizations that understand that spinouts can be strategic for them, they know that they might be able to acquire these spinouts later on, and they have special knowledge about the value of the innovations of those spinouts because a lot of them originated within the parent organization, right? And so what they like to have sometimes is a large number of spinouts that are kind of like, to think about them almost like as R&D footholds that are out there for the parent organization that they can tap into to learn from them or to do an acquisition later on. And so they often view it as a more kind of low cost approach to doing innovation. So rather than doing all of that internally and having all that investment having to come from internal, it happens more externally within for spinouts, and then they can still benefit from that later on.
And do you think, Andre, just, again, these questions are popping up in my head as we speak. Do you think like this makes more sense for a public company more than a private company? Because when they are public, they are public companies. So they more or less, they need to share, I mean, of course, not the secrets of the R&Ds and what they are working on specifically, but I mean, their initiatives. So probably if they spin out, if a couple of people, they go and spin out, so they are working, they are a completely separate entity, not related to the main business. So maybe it's a good way for them to encourage maybe spin outs versus maybe a private company. Still, maybe they are like, I don't know, 7-8 years old, and still, they don't have all the eyes on them. So is there something relatable here? I'm not sure if I made sense here.
Well, we see spinouts coming out of organizations at all the different stages. Even sometimes startups that are just a few years old have encounter spinouts. Sometimes it's a disagreement between the co-founders or other things that lead to spinouts, right? So we do see them in large startups. We see them in large tech firms that, especially the ones that have big budgets for innovation. They're constantly funding all types of different projects, and many of those projects just aren't going to fit with the company's strategy at the end of the day, right? So we even see them in declining businesses. I mean, one example is Nokia. So when Nokia's handset business was declining, they had a rather large division that they needed to shut down, and they were facing the prospect actually of laying off thousands of people. And so they actually created what they called the bridge program. And what they did was they provided entrepreneurial education to all of the employees that were working in that division, and they gave them the option to take an idea and the IP for that idea and to take it into a spin-out venture. And they even provided some bridge financing to help them do it. And so rather than seeing something as a total loss, right, laying off and shutting down a division, what they did was they took all of the great ideas that were in that division, they allowed them to flourish externally. And what that did for the company too, if you think about Nokia, in its home country, what it did is it created a robust pool of human resources still working on different tech companies within their region. So later on, when they want to grow another division, well, they have a pool of resources to draw on and a bunch of different innovations that they might be able to pursue as well. And so companies with a long-term vision like that, and like Nokia, I think they can take advantage of spinouts even in their decline.
Absolutely. Now, one thing that also I think we didn't discuss, how an employee, he or she, they know that, what, like, it's now time to me to leave here. I need to go and start this by myself. So what are like kind of the signals, let's say, that they, they start to, they will take into consideration, so they know that, okay, now it's time for us to leave and start our own thing. And, what happens afterwards?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that there really is a signal necessarily, but we do hear, from the interviews that we've done with many of these spin-out founders, we do tend to hear a lot of the same things kind of coming up. For instance, this dissatisfaction with the management or how things are managed within the existing company, and what that usually comes with is an idea of how to do it better, right? So they've come to a point in their career where they know enough that they feel like they understand how the business works, and they also think that maybe they could do it better, right? And as soon as they get into that mindset, then usually it's just like a matter of time before they're triggered into actually doing their spin out or leaving to go and work for another company or something like that, right? And so that can take more or less time depending on the individual. We've seen people do a co-op work term for a couple of semesters at a company And that was enough for them to gain the idea and to leave and do their own spin out, right? Whereas other people stay and work for a company for 10, 15 years before they get to that point where they feel that they're ready. But when they are ready, there are many different types of triggers, and one of the triggers is a financial trigger. That think about, call them liquidity events and things like that. You mentioned public companies. Well, a lot of employees in public companies, or especially as they're going public, they have shares in the companies, and when companies go for an IPO, for example, what often happens is it creates a bunch of liquidity for a lot of the employees that were working there and who had a bunch of shares in the company. And now they can sell those shares and have a bunch of money to start a spin out venture or any company of their own, right? And so we do see these events that happen that can create almost like a whole bunch of spin outs at the same time, right? Another example is when PayPal was acquired by eBay, right? eBay had a very different management style than PayPal did. And when they tried to implement this very kind of rational management style, what it did was it created a clash, and a lot of the more entrepreneurial employees at PayPal, they couldn't stand for it, and they ended up leaving. And most of those ended up starting their own companies, right? And so sometimes they happen in waves. So it's interesting to see this phenomenon, both at the individual level and as a wave,
Yeah, and one thing, Andre, like with now, because you mentioned something that, of course, like more and more these liquidity events are happening, and I mean, and globally, I have a feeling that there is a more, you know, if you ask someone maybe, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, are you going any time to be an entrepreneur, or I mean to found your company? Nah, like I'm staying in the company, to your point, like they used to stay long time. Are we do you expect to see more of these spin outs events in the future? Because now everyone, they start to look around and said, hey, like if they were able to do it, I can do it. If they were able to be successful, I can be successful. I can get funds. I can do this. I can do that. So are we expecting to see more spin outs in the market?
Yeah, I do think so. I think it's increasingly difficult to do a de novo startup unless it's a spin out coming out of university research or something like that. I mean, most of especially in the tech industry, there's knowledge that's needed, know-how that's needed, not something that could just be acquired by a book, right? And so I think increasingly what we're seeing is in a more complex world, most of the startups, the successful startups that we're going to see are going to be spin outs, because they need to take that some of that knowledge with them. You gave the example of Intel earlier, and actually, if you look at Silicon Valley and you look at this process of creating chips, right? Shockley was the first one in their laboratory, and then Fairchild came out of that, and they were producing them, and then Intel and AMD, and it's all really it's like a lineage of companies. And the reason for that is that the know-how needed to be able to actually produce chips, isn't something that someone on the street can just figure out. I mean, even in university laboratories, it's very difficult to figure it out, and it takes a lot of trial and error and process and observing and seeing what happens. And so that's why it's so important to have that experience within the companies actually doing it before trying to do it yourself. And so I think that technology, the way that it's developing, I think we're in an increasingly complex world, and we're going to see a greater and greater percentage, I think, of companies which are startups, which are spinouts instead of being de novo.
Got you. So, Andre, as we are almost coming to an end, I ask this question for anyone whose specialization is in entrepreneurship. So, if you want to leave us with your final advice for fellow entrepreneurs, what would it be?
Yeah, I think for those that are working in organizations right now, I think a lot of them sometimes see a job as a kind of trap, or as maybe just as a way to produce income, rather than seeing it as a learning environment or as an opportunity. And so I think that if we can sort of change the way that we think about employment, instead of just being a place that we're doing our work or earning our income, we can see it as a learning environment where innovations are happening and perhaps not being pursued, and looking at it from that lens, and thinking about all the different stakeholders involved in an industry and what it is that they want, and are they getting what they want. And I think if we turn that entrepreneurial lens on our employing organizations, then we can learn a heck of a lot about what our next startup might look like.
Fantastic. Finally, Andre, where people can find the book and how they can get connected with you.
Yeah, I mean, they can get connected with me through LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find just by my name. It's a somewhat unique name, I suppose. The book's available, Spinout Ventures, available on Amazon and all over the place, and all the normal places that you'd find the books. And I hope that people who are interested in finding out more, both on the managerial side. So the book is written in a way that someone who's an employee who wants to do a spinout can learn a lot about what that's like and what the process is like and what the do's and don'ts are. But it's also written in a way that a manager working in an incumbent company can read the book and better understand how to manage or how to deal with employees who want to leave and do spinouts, and how to view it also as an opportunity rather than as a negative thing.
Great. I will make sure that I will put the links in the show notes or in the description if you're watching this on YouTube. Andre, really, I enjoyed the discussion with you. And, the reason, I liked especially your last piece of advice about spending the time in organizations. So to learn how you can do operations, how you do sales, how you do marketing, how you do the whole thing, and then go out and, follow your passion, as they say. And, all the insight that you gave us today. And I think, the myth is busted, I would say. Majority of the time, companies are spin outs. So thank you very much for sharing, these valuable information with us today. I really appreciate it. And this is how usually I end my episode. This is for the audience. If you just discovered this podcast by chance, thank you for passing by. If you liked this episode, please do give us a thumb up and subscribe. We are available on all podcasting platforms. And of course, if you are one of the people who keeps listening to us and sending me your feedbacks and questions and clarifications, keep doing so. I read all your suggestions and all your feedback. So please do keep doing that. Thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll be again very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hit that subscribe button. Share the show with your tech-savvy friends and fellow entrepreneurs. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. Your support means the world to us.